Hey everyone, and welcome to today's ninth grade explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to be your guide for this one. Today, we're diving into exactly how authors choose to order events in a text, how to identify the stages of a plot, and how to analyze plot development. Seriously, let's get into it. We're going to learn how to think completely differently about the books we read and the movies we watch. We are officially done being just mere spectators. Today, we start thinking like the actual architects of the story.
So here's our game plan for today, 6 quick steps. We'll kick things off with goals and plot basics, jump into identifying stages of plot, and then break down how authors order events. After that, we'll run through a model for analyzing plot choices, do a quick misconception check to make sure we're on track, and wrap it all up with a formative check and recap. Let's do this.
Section 1. Goals and Plot Basics. Let's set up the foundation of how an author actively constructs a narrative.
Okay, so a while back, a group of literary critics known as the Formalists decided to split narratives into two totally distinct concepts: the story, which they called the fabula, and the plot, which they called the sujet. Now, I know that sounds like a bunch of heavy technical jargon, but it's actually the secret code to understanding how authors manipulate our experience. Think of it kind of like baking. The story is just your raw ingredients, right? It's literally everything that happens in that narrative universe. But the plot, that is your final, beautifully baked cake. It's the author's very specific selection and ordering of those raw events.
Let's break that down just a bit more. The story is just the strict chronological sequence of events. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. But authors are architects. They don't just hand you a boring timeline. The plot is their deliberate, carefully arranged, and sometimes completely non-chronological presentation of those events. They are actively choosing what to show you, what to skip over entirely, and what order to present things in, just to build a very specific experience for you, the reader.
Section 2. Identifying stages of plot. Let's move on and see exactly how an author builds that plot architecture using specific, recognizable stages. You've probably seen these classical plot stages a million times. This is the standard structure we see in most mainstream stories. They're designed to resolve problems and restore order. You've got an inciting incident that kicks everything off, followed by the rising action as all that tension starts to build. And that pushes the narrative all the way to a crisis or climax, the absolute peak of the action, before finally settling down into a resolution where all those loose story threads get neatly tied up.
But let's contrast that classical model with the Aristotelian timeline. Based on Aristotle's Poetics, this model highlights a really crucial core division. Aristotle basically insisted on two main parts, the complication and the unraveling. So the complication extends from the very beginning of the action all the way up to the climax, which marks the major turning point to either good or bad fortune. Then the unraveling, or denouement, is everything that happens from the beginning of that big change right up until the end. Viewing it this way helps authors focus entirely on incidents that either strictly complicate or strictly unravel the central action.
Section 3. How authors order events. Let's transition into our third section, focusing on the specific mechanics and techniques authors use to manipulate time and sequence. Authors basically have a whole toolkit for ordering events. They use techniques like starting in medias res, which literally means jumping right into the middle of the action. It's kind of like dropping into a video game mid-boss fight. They also use pacing, flashbacks, parallel plots, and repetition. By manipulating time in these ways, the author totally breaks away from a simple, predictable chronological timeline to serve the specific, exciting needs of the plot.
Let's clearly define a couple of these specific time manipulation tricks. A parallel plot happens when an author organizes events so that two main characters have separate but related storylines that eventually crash together and merge. A flashback, on the other hand, is used when a character recalls a past experience. Both of these completely disrupt standard chronological pacing, showing us just how actively the author is working behind the scenes to construct the plot development.
Section 4. Model, analyzing plot choices. Now, let's apply these concepts to some classic examples. We're going to analyze these structural choices exactly like a film director or a master author would. As we noted a second ago, the ancient philosopher Aristotle advised a super powerful authorial choice: begin in medias res, in the midst of things. Because really, why start at the boring, chronological beginning of a character's life when you can just drop the audience right into the action, as close to the climactic event of the protagonist's life as humanly possible? Let's look at this in practice. Take Euripides' ancient play, Medea. If the author just wanted to tell the chronological story, he would have started years earlier, but the plot begins with Medea already totally aware of Jason's betrayal. The author deliberately bypasses all of that chronological past.
Actually, scratch that. It's more like he deletes it entirely to create an immediate, highly focused complication right from the very opening scene.
We see the exact same thing with our second model, Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. Again, this doesn't start at the chronological beginning of his life. We don't see his birth or his childhood. The author places the beginning of the plot near the climax of Oedipus's life. This is a very deliberate choice, entirely distinct from a chronological biography. The author structures the events so that the entire narrative focuses purely on the unraveling of a crisis.
For our third model, let's look at a film from our source materials, Ingmar Bergman's Wild Strawberries. This film masterfully uses flashbacks to manipulate time. It presents the protagonist's inner reality, his past and his memories, alongside his outer, present reality. What's crucial to take away here is that the author's choice to order events with flashbacks doesn't harm the necessary sequence of events at all. Instead, it tightly structures the plot development to show us exactly what we need to see to understand the character's journey. Section 5. Misconception Check. We've covered some pretty complex structural ideas, so let's pause for a misconception check to ensure we aren't falling into a super common 9th grade analytical trap.
So I want to ask you this direct question. Does a narrative having a beginning, middle, and end mean the text must be ordered chronologically? Some writing theorists in the past claim that every story absolutely must start at its chronological beginning. But based on what we've just learned, I challenge you to think about what a beginning really means in a constructed plot.
Misconception busted. A narrative must have a beginning, middle, and end, for sure, but that absolutely does not mean it has to be chronological. Remember, the fabula, the raw story material, is chronological. But the sujet, the plot, is the author's chosen order. The author is an architect who can totally manipulate time, use flashbacks, and jump around, just so long as the events are logically connected by cause and effect. Section 6, Formative Check and Recap. All right, we've made it to our final section. It is time to test our new knowledge and summarize the core mechanics of how authors build plots.
Okay, here's your formative check question. What is the technical term for an author's choice to start a plot right in the middle of a conflict, rather than at the chronological start? I'll give you a second to lock that answer in your head.
And the answer is in medias res. If you got that right, fantastic job. You have firmly grasped one of the most absolutely crucial structural concepts authors use to grab our attention and manipulate the plot timeline. Let's do a super quick recap of our 3 core takeaways. First, we learned the critical difference between the plot and the story, or the sujet versus the fabula. The story just happens, but authors construct the plot. Second, we learned about plot stages, particularly Aristotle's focus on the complication and the unraveling. And third, we analyzed event ordering, looking at exactly how authors actively manipulate time using awesome techniques like in medias res, parallel plots, and flashbacks.
So, I want to leave you with this final provocative question. How will you view the architecture of the plot in the very next movie or book you experience? Will you just sit back and watch the chronological story unfold, or will you actively look for the author's deliberate, strategic choices? My challenge to you is to actively look for the structure. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and hey, happy analyzing!